Hello everyone, Rob here. As I'm sure you already know by now, Creative Assembly just released a few days ago a trailer for Total War Warhammer 2. It's going to be taking place in the Games Workshop world of Lustria in the New World, which is basically a fantasy equivalent of South America. It's going to have Skaven and High Elves, Dark Elves, and Lizardmen, and if that means absolutely nothing to you, well, I'm not going to help you out with that. You're going to have to check out somebody like Arch Warhammer. He's way better versed at this sort of thing than I am. Well, in addition to this, Creative Assembly has also released a statement that they are working on a historical title, and it's going to be covering an era that they haven't actually covered previously. Now, we know from previous Total War games, they've covered ancient Rome, they've covered the samurai in both of the shoguns, and they've covered the medieval era, and they've also covered the kind of the mid-early modern period, which I know doesn't make any sense, but basically, the 1700s into the Napoleonic era thereabouts. Now, I have no idea what they're going to be covering. There's been rumors about a Victoria Total War, which sounds interesting, but really this is just me speculating as to what they might be doing, as well as what I would like to see from a Total War franchise. So the first up is the Warring States period of China. Now, there's some debate historically as to when the Warring States period actually started. Most historians say somewhere in the early part of the 5th century BC. Some say 481 BC, some say 475, some go actually as late as 403. Really, it all depends on who you talk to. In any case, it's right about the same time the Persians were getting involved with the Greeks. The Peloponnesian War was going on in the West, and really this era is concurrent with the classical period in the West. Now, while the exact date for the beginning of the war is pretty vague, the ending is actually very specific. It ended in 221 BC with the establishment of the Qin dynasty, which eventually ruled China for the next, only about 15 years before it was eventually replaced by the Han dynasty, but that's another story for another day. Now, at this point in history, China was divided into 7 different nations, and I'm about to mispronounce every single one of them. I have limitations. Don't judge me. Anyway, there's the Jin, who eventually did take over all of China and establish the Jin dynasty. There's also the 3 Jins, which are the Han, the Wei, and the Zhao, as well as the Qi, the Chu, and the Yan, as well as a bunch of other smaller states. Szechuan, I think, is one of them, a couple others as well. And yes, I'm aware I just butchered all those names. Thank you for your indulgence. Please don't judge me. Anyway, what I think a Total War game can do here is really play up the diplomacy and the politics a lot more than we've seen in previous titles. In order to really control these areas, you're going to have to really play up the diplomacy aspect, play one nation against the other, rather than just a straight military approach. Now, you could go for a straight military approach. That's the appeal of Total War, but I think you can do something a little bit different with this type of a title. Here you can really embrace the teachings of Sun Tzu, who said that direct military action was a last resort, and diplomacy and playing enemies against each other was vastly preferable. Now, I don't know that much about Chinese warfare, especially from this time period, but as far as I do know, they did have things like chariots, as well as lance and spear-armed cavalry. I think they did have some bow cavalry as well that they picked up from the Mongolians, who might actually be a faction in this as well. Now, as far as infantry is concerned, as far as I can tell, they used large blocks of infantry, very similar to what was going on in Europe at this time. They were armed with these halberds that had this pick on the end. They formed right angles. These would be supported by large banks of archers and some artillery, catapults, and the like. Now, I know they have done Eastern Total War franchises before, the Shogun series, but I think this would be a nice change. Most of the others have been Western-centric, and I just think it would be a good idea to move on beyond Europe and beyond the Americas and really see what goes on in this period, which really isn't covered. If there is something in ancient China, usually it's in the Three Kingdoms period, which comes a couple centuries later. So this would be a nice change from that. Now, for the next historical period that I think the Total War series would do well to cover would be the Bronze Age, especially the Bronze Age in and around the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, that area in particular. Now, whereas the Warring States period was a bit more monotone, everybody being Chinese, everybody being more or less of the same culture, here you can really expand out and really focus on many, many different cultures over a fairly wide time period. Now, the Bronze Age is a very broad time period. You have many different areas that can be covered here. You can talk about the Mycenaeans in the later section, right before the Bronze Age collapsed. You can talk about the fall of Troy, roughly from the same era. You can also talk about the rise of the Hittites, the rise of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and go way back all the way to the Mesopotamians and the dawn of civilization. Really, it depends on what you were trying to accomplish here. Now, unlike my opinion for the warring states, this is going to be a lot less diplomacy, a lot more warfare. I mean, Assyrian diplomacy is pretty much, we have an army and we're going to break into your city, we're going to burn everything and basically rape, pillage, murder, all that fun stuff. Any case, so there's going to be a lot more just straight up military, a lot less focus on diplomacy. You could, of course, have that, but I think this should just be a straight up war of conquest. And there's actually, because there's so many different factions that could possibly be here, there's going to be a great variety of different troop types and different play styles. Now, the richer and more advanced states, the more established states, things like Egypt, Assyria, the Hittites, they were much wealthier, so they'd be able to afford things like chariots. And for them, infantry would really be a secondary consideration. Really good cavalry in form of chariots. They really didn't have horseback cavalry at this point. Actually, putting a man on a horse really didn't come around at this era. I'm sure you could put it in just for the sake of balance, but it really wouldn't be as potent as it would be in a later era. So for them, though, cavalry in the form of chariots would be the mainstay of their army. However, the infantry would just be a supporting arm, not very powerful in its own right. Bows are of, I guess you can say, of middling quality, at least in terms of foot archers. There were archers mounted on the back of a chariot. That was one of the mainstays of Egyptian warfare. But really just infantry, archers on foot walking around would not be as potent. Now, for less wealthy and less established civilizations like the Mycenaeans, they would probably have to rely on things like infantry. They did have chariots, they just didn't use them all that often. They're really more for their nobles to act as battle taxis and as escape pods. So they show up in battle, they ride out on their pimped out chariot looking all, badass. And then what do? They get out, they fight on foot, and if things go bad, they turn tail and run, which is, you can use that as a mechanic. You want to save, say, your general, you can have him hop back in a chariot, and he can get out of there real quick. Now, this, of course, was the era of the Homeric hero, so you can possibly do something with that. Have an agent whose job is to go out in front of enemy lines, disrupt them by issuing challenges, which can disrupt enemy formations, give a morale bonus to your own men, or you could possibly deteriorate the morale of the enemy. You can do this with other enemy agents as well. You can issue challenges to them, something along those lines. While I think this particular title would be best if it were to focus on the Mediterranean basin and the Middle East, Mesopotamia, that area, it would be nice if they were to include something like the Celts. Now, the Celts were not a specifically or a unified force at this particular time, but something on the fringes of society, a sort of a barbarian faction, a horde faction, wouldn't necessarily be a bad addition. It might be a little ahistorical, but, for the sake of completeness and, hey, they're Celts, they're badass. Why not throw them in anyway? And for the final Total War game, or at least what I would like to see from a Total War game, Total War 20th Century. Honestly, it would be pretty interesting to see how they would be able to pull off something of that scale. I mean, most other Total War games have been fairly limited geographically, whether it's in Japan or in Europe. Now, they did have a global system within Empire Total War, but that was really kind of clunky. But to have the actual world map as just the basic play map, and you can relive the rise and fall of various civilizations or various nations within the course of the 20th century. The Soviet Union, Tsarist Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the rise of the Japanese Empire. And maybe I'm being a little jingoistic here, but the American Empire, how it went from a regional power at the beginning of the 20th century to being the global superpower, the only global superpower by the end of it. Have that depicted, or have that as an option to be able to be played. Now, in addition to the normal political and diplomacy aspect of a Total War game, as well as the military aspect, which is really the hallmark of a Total War game, you can actually add in a little bit more of a nuanced economic system, where you can have communism versus capitalism, colonialism as a force. I don't know how that would play out, but honestly, it's something worth looking into. And yes, you could have a military campaign where it's just a straight up fight like World War II or World War I, but also you can have some sort of mechanic where there's insurgencies and proxy wars prop up dictatorships, more intelligence gathering services, things like CIA launching coups against rival nations and their allies, something along those lines. Again, I'm not sure how that would work out necessarily, but it's something definitely worth looking into. Just a brief thought. I haven't really gone over it too much, but just something figured it might be an interesting thing that they might be able to try or might be able to pull off properly. So that's just my brief thoughts on this. I hope you found it interesting, and we'll see what Creative Assembly has to say. I'm sure more releases will be coming out in the near future, more information. Till then, have a good day. See you later.